Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are in drum taps and we are now working with the poem Over the Carnage, Rose Prophetic Voice. It's interesting syntax, and we'll maybe talk a bit about why it's constructed that way. This is poem 25 of the 43 of drum taps. I want to remind you that we've argued that Leaves of Grass is a sustained theodicy, very much so drum taps. And of course, into the O Cause, I want to remind you that Whitman said, "My book and the war are one." We might say about that line that one of the most important things is that it's not just a sustained theodicy, but it is a hopeful theodicy. I think that's an important point to make here, especially as we're reading a poem like this. It's significant, I think, for readers of Leaves of Grass, who will report that, man, getting through some of those middle poems of drum taps is so difficult. Vigil Strange comes to mind. I mean, there's several of those. March Unknown comes to mind. It's really difficult poems to get through and read, and we commented on that earlier. A poem like this is placed, I think, apropos. I do. I think Whitman knows exactly what he's doing in putting a poem here that will be more hopeful in its theodicy. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt, our playlist. And you've already experienced everything that precedes this, including a set of introductory comments for drum taps. We, of course, just did Dirge to Veterans. Our Nortons, to give us a bit of background information here, will tell us that all but the first and the last lines of this poem were originally part of the 1860 columnist number 5, here rearranged. Its present form has remained unchanged in its inclusion in the 1865 drum taps. Plainly, Norton's to finish, says Whitman hoped that the sentiment of manly affection, a phrase that gets used only one time in all Leaves of Grass, and it's right here, would be the cohering principle of the nation in time of peril. Now, in some ways, you could make the argument that this is one of the most utopian-like of poems for Whitman. If you're going to argue that Whitman is a blind optimist, this may be a poem that would suggest that, although, as I've said, I'm never going to call him a blind optimist. I'm going to call him an informed optimist, as we've said in earlier lectures. But this is for sure where Whitman will meet Plato and the Republic. He'll meet More's Utopia and this notion of an almost utopian vision of the future. By the way, I just want to point out to you as we get ready to read this, note the power of the word "yet" through this poem. The syntax, of course, is interesting. Over the carnage, rose prophetic a voice. It is, I think, it makes you slow down for just a moment to pay attention to, of course, the word carnage. Banner at daybreak, you'll remember, with terror and carnage. It's the only other time in drum taps that it really matters that we're pointing that use of that word out. Prophetic was used in starting from Pomanog 10. You'll remember this prophetic spirit. And I think that Whitman is oftentimes jumping into the biblical alliterative tradition. And prophetic, of course, will take us to the book of Lamentations and obviously Jeremiah. And as I've said, if Whitman is constructing the New American Bible, then we're certainly in drum taps and in Memories of Lincoln going to be playing around with a version of Lamentations. But here, notice, it's going to be a theodicy that argues that over the carnage rose prophetic a voice. Now, whose voice it is will be the subject of a lot of debate. Is it Whitman talking to himself, or is it Whitman depressed and in despair, as we've seen in a few earlier poems? Whitman in despair is hearing a voice that will say, "Be not disheartened, affection shall solve the problems of freedom yet." And notice the use of the word "yet" as we play the game with that word. In other words, love is going to solve this problem, affection. Those who love each other shall become invincible, pointing out, of course, that the last word of the last poem, Dirge for Two Veterans, was the word love, right? Already used over 20 times already in drum taps. It's remarkable how this word keeps coming back. It's one of the most popular words in all of Leaves of Grass. Notice how he says it. Those who love each other shall become invincible. They shall yet make Columbia victorious. And of course, Columbia is kind of a symbol of democracy and of America. Sons of the mother of all, notice capitalized mother of all, You shall yet, notice the second use of the word, be victorious. You shall yet laugh to scorn the attacks of all the remainder of the earth. Taking us back to too long America, when I made that observation of the significance of to show to the world of the Declaration of Independence, let facts be submitted to a candid world, is the way Jefferson says it. I think that Whitman is constantly aware, because he spent so much time with Emerson, he's constantly aware that Europe is watching this new experiment called American democracy, and he wants in his Leaves of Grass to remind Americans we're being watched, and we are the propaedeutic. We are instructional to the rest of the world, both backwards and forwards looking. We are the city on a hill, of course, and all those ideas. Notice he says it. No danger shall balk Columbia's lovers. You'll maybe remember the word balk. It's used in Song of Myself 23, faith that never balks. In other words, can't be stopped. Love can't be stopped. If need be, 1,000, I told you he loves these big numbers, 1,000 shall sternly immolate themselves for one, to sacrifice. The willingness to sacrifice. Here's his theodicy. All that sacrifice, we go back to Lincoln and the Gettysburg, of course, address. All of that has got to be for a purpose, right? As Lincoln will say it. They gave their last full measure, right? And then he says, one from Massachusetts, and now the shall be, the future, the vision. Here's the vision for Whitman. One from Massachusetts shall be a Missourian's comrade. We know about the use of that word, right? From Maine and from hot Carolina, and another an Organese shall be friends truant. In other words, we're going to create the new Trinity, and it will be from all over the Union. People will finally come together. And then he says it, more precious. You'll remember this phraseology from Song of the Open Road, right at the end, 15, when he says, I give you my love more precious than money. Notice here, more precious to each other than all the riches of the earth. Again, for Whitman, he wants to constantly argue there's something more important about our democracy and our country than economics. There's something foundational, there's something deeply rooted, and he will call it affection or love. To Michigan, Florida, perfumes shall tenderly come. I told you about his use of the word come from the very first word of Leaves of Grass, right? Not the perfumes of flower, but sweeter and wafted beyond death. There's Song of Myself, passage 6, and his theodicy there. To die is different and luckier, and here we are again. In other words, it will take the sacrifice that immolate, that word that only gets used one time in all Leaves of Grass, and it's here. That sacrifice was necessary, but in the end it will lead to a stronger nation. It shall be customary, now here again, in the future, it shall. It shall be customary in the houses and streets to see manly affection. The most dauntless and rude, again, rude here is simple, shall touch face to face lightly. This is a compelling idea. The idea that, it won't matter. Class won't matter. The very highest, the dauntless, as well as the very simplest, the rude, shall touch face to face. The language obviously here is almost like kissing, right? The idea of manly affection and all of that. The dependence of liberty shall be lovers. The continuance of equality shall be comrades. Many have read this as unbelievably Marxist sounding, right? You'll maybe remember that from Roadside Collection, that word, that poem called Thought, remember, of equality. We're playing the same game again. These shall tie you. I told you about grabbing, hugging, binding. These shall tie you and band you stronger. Now, this is, I said to you guys, I think Whitman's having so much fun in writing these poems, and notice the use of the word band. You remember the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected to another and to assume on the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which laws of nature's God entitled them. Notice here the use of the language, tie you and band you stronger than hoops of iron, and of course Whitman's audience will smile because this will take them back to the Polonius speech, to Laertes and Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 3, grappled into the heart with hoops of steel. Here it's hoops of iron. I, ecstatic, you'll remember this from Eidolons, early on in inscriptions. O partners, O lands, with the love of lovers tie you. In other words, in the end, what's going to bring us all together will be this affection, this love that we will have for each other and for our country. And then, in parenthetics, a rhetorical set of questions, which will take us back to Song of the Open Road 15. Were you looking to be held together by lawyers? Or by an agreement on a paper? Or by arms? Nay. Now, this is directly, I think, a reference to Virgil's Aeneid 6, where in the underworld you'll remember that Aeneas is going to visit with his father, who will then say, what will make Rome so great will be lawyers, be law. It'll be this notion of being equal in front of the law. For Whitman, while that's an important idea, it isn't foundational. More important than any of those things having to do with law is love for Whitman. Nay, he says, nor the world nor any living thing will so cohere. Now, this is the only use of this word cohere in this way. I sing Body Electric number 6, cohered is used. That bringing together, that binding together. In other words, if Whitman is the wound dresser, and I think that's why that poem is so vital to our reading of Leaves of Grass, as in binding the wounds, then certainly he will argue we will bind our wounds only through love, through affection. That is to say it to a love is the only way true democracy ever actually happens. At 2b, I like the uncertainty of the voice. Which prophetic voice are we working with? Is it one that Whitman hears, or is it Whitman himself speaking to himself, a la Song of Myself, for example, passage 5 or whatever? At 3a, I just want to point out that Plato's Republic has to be an important part of our reading of this poem. You'll remember that in Republic, we've given full lectures at learnstrong.net, and you can go back and review it, but we've talked about the 4 cardinal virtues, you'll remember, of wisdom and courage and temperance, discipline, and justice, right? And it was St. Augustine who pointed out that missing from those 4 cardinal virtues is faith, hope, and love, right? The Christian virtues. Of course, when you combine the 4 cardinal virtues of Plato with the 3 virtues of 1 Corinthians 13, the Pauline, the Christian virtues, you get the magic number of 7, right? For Whitman, all of the virtues are going to be subsumed in love, which is why that's foundational to a democracy. Finally, at 3b, what are your thoughts on this one? Is love all we need in the end? I mean, the Beatles said it in a song. John Lennon and his pal Paul McCartney and the boys said it. All you need is love. Is that true in the end? Or is this just a certain kind of optimism or an idealism that has to be taken with a grain of salt? Is, in the end, love what ultimately binds us, not only as Americans, but inhabitants of the world? We'll get to that one when we do Passage to India. Thank you.